With it being the Halloween season, it is the perfect time to go and revisit some iconic horror classics that will definitely provide atmosphere and tension in abundance, that will definitely leave a lasting impact, leaving you wanting more. In this video, I've put together a list of what I consider to be the 12 scariest horror games that you can play on the PS2 that I think will provide all of those attributes that you are looking for if you are a fan of the survival horror genre. And the PS2 is no stranger to the many iconic elements that have been produced within the gaming space, as the PS2 is not only the greatest selling console of all time, but it is also home to some of the most fear-driven titles ever in existence. So for that reason alone, it is worthwhile sticking around to check out all of these games so that you can have a clear idea of what you can expect, what you should revisit, and maybe even find a hidden gem that you have yet to experience. When it released in 2001, Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare saw a return to form with the iconic and legendary series that originally started the whole survival horror genre, that would later gain popularity with the Resident Evil series seen on the original PlayStation. This version of the game, however, would be classed as a re-envisioning or a remake of the series to fit into the modern era, but would still manage to traipse its way back with elements that reflect those seen in the original titles way back in the PC from the early 90s. That saw the reprisal of Edward Carnby alongside of a young professor with Aline Cedric that go to an unknown island to investigate the whereabouts of a known professor, to find out information surrounding Carnby's best friend who had recently been murdered, but also to uncover the many secrets hidden within the tombs and caverns that are hidden within the island itself, that are known to house dark and terrifying powers if unleashed. So it is up to the pair of protagonists to figure out the betrayal and the murder of Carnby's friend, but also to uncover the secrets of the island to stop the elements and secrets from falling into the wrong hands. And the game would take a lot of inspiration not only from the earlier Alone in the Dark series of the early 90s, but it would also take a lot of its inspiration from the early Resident Evil games, with its dark, gritty atmosphere, use of devastating weaponry, but also house many grotesque and terrifying creatures that hide in the shadows and can only be really defeated through the use of the weapons that you procure and also the use of light. So you have to be mindful of your surroundings at all times, as enemies can appear at a moment's notice and you must have your wits about you in order to survive. So as in with any survival horror game in the genre, you owe it to yourself as a fan of these type of games to revisit the series that started it all. And this game in particular, in its current state, is considered to be one of the best games in the series, and it's also one of the scariest. And it is, even to this day, still one of the scariest games that you will get to play on the PlayStation 2 or any of the consoles it was released on. PlayStation 2 was home to a multitude of varying survival horror titles, very like the PlayStation 1 way back during the 90s. It also had a mixed selection of varying titles that some would achieve massive success while others would fall under the radar and be left in obscurity, mainly due to reasons of quality and just lack of budget in terms of development and so forth, but still presented a very prominent experience that gave players a good alternative to the more mainstream games in the genre. And Cursed Eye of Isis presented one of those opportunities. While not as fully polished compared to the heavy hitters with Resident Evil and Silent Hill, the game was given the term of a more budget title, but still presented enough suspense and atmosphere that managed to capture the scary nature of horror games of that period. That saw an incident in the Great British Museum of Natural History dating back to the late 1800s, seeing a gang of ruthless thugs stealing an Egyptian artifact that holds significant powers, which results in unleashing a curse within the museum itself, and anyone that comes into contact with the mysterious fog that surrounds the environment ends up transforming them into grotesque monsters and zombie-like creatures that are hell-bent on destruction and killing anyone that crossed their path. So it is up to the two protagonists in the game, with Darian Dane and Victoria Sutton, where they must not only stop the occurrence within the museum, but must travel to different areas across the globe in order to find the footprints of where the artifact has been hidden, in order to restore it to its former place and sanctuary, to stop the curse once and for all. And the game would take many elements and many cues from the Resident Evil series, and even with Silent Hill. Not so much with the graphics, but it definitely used some of the gameplay mechanics with the fixed camera perspectives, the use of weapons, ammunition preservation, and the different types of enemies that you would encounter as you play. So you have to conserve all of your life and ammo items in order to be able to progress, while also solving a variety of different puzzles to unlock different secrets, find keys to unlock doors to progress, not just in the museum itself, but also to escape and to find areas of interest within other regions that you will explore later in the game. And the game itself does present a very dark and gritty atmosphere, very similar to those iconic games, so that is definitely among one of its best features. As the game is presented back in the Gothic era, where there is limited electricity, so the lighting is very, very limited, it would almost be very similar to that seen in Nightmare Creatures that would have been released on the PlayStation 1 way back in the late 90s, as that had a very similar aesthetic. So it is a unique experience. While not considered as the greatest survival horror game ever made, it does present something unique with tension and atmosphere that will provide a thrilling experience, and it will be a good alternative to the more mainstream games. So if you're looking for something a bit different with regards to horror games on the PS2, then Cursed Eye of Isis is definitely a game that should be explored in more detail. The X-Files Resistor Serve was released for the PlayStation in 2004. That is a survival horror game that takes much influence from the Resident Evil series, even with Silent Hill, among others. And the plot of the game is based around the 7th season, almost kind of like a spin-off episode, with its own intricate story and voiced by the original characters from the iconic TV series, that sees Mulder and Scully investigating a series of mysterious deaths in Colorado that lead them all the way inevitably to Tunguska in Russia to discover a spaceship crashed nearly 100 years ago that houses an alien virus that is transforming people within the vicinity into hideous zombie-like creatures and monsters. The gameplay takes premise from a fixed camera perspective, using tank controls that were made popular with earlier Resident Evil games. So it adds that unique dynamic to the gameplay style, while also adding in the cinematic appeal from the TV series to make for a very unique, dark, thrilling and atmospheric experience. While the game itself did receive mixed reviews from critics, it was praised for its storytelling and writing and its unique voice acting. But it is a very good alternative to the Resident Evil games if you are a fan of the series, as it is very dark, it's very gritty, and manages to capture all of the dark elements from the TV show but puts it into a video game, which is not often a case with video games being transitioned back and forth between the TV screen. Very few games have ever managed to capture those elements, but this game manages to do that in its entirety, and it does it very well. The game is very dark, very gritty, has a great soundtrack, it's very serious and atmospheric, that provides a lot of unnerving tension and can present many disturbing elements throughout each section in the game that definitely will leave a lasting impact if you're a fan of this style of survival horror game. And if you're a fan of the TV show, and even if you're a fan of earlier classic survival horror games with these unique gameplay elements, you definitely must give this game a try, as it will appeal to all of those dynamics to give you a taste and a great alternative to some of the most iconic games ever created within the survival horror genre. Manhunt, released in 2003, would be considered among some of the most controversial games ever in existence, that acts as a stealth action game, developed by Rockstar North and published by Rockstar Games. The game also saw a release for both the Windows PC and Xbox, that would see players take on the role of James Earl Cash, a death row prisoner who is forced to participate in a series of unusual snuff films, where he is forced to murder criminal gang members members on camera to earn his freedom. The gameplay results in a mixture of action, stealth, but also survival horror elements, as it depicts a very dark take on the modern world, and it showcases people, humans, to be the real monsters in this scenario. And in order for players to survive each encounter or each scene in the game, players must guide Earl to defeat enemies using any way possible, from incapacitating them using environmental hazards, lead pipes, swords, glass shards, plastic bags, even guns, and anything that they can use at their disposal to dispatch enemies in the most graphic, visual and most grotesque ways possible. And it's due to these factors that saw the game being banned in many countries due to the controversy surrounding its gameplay content. But what you are presented with in the game is a very dark and atmospheric experience that is very, very different from other survival horror games that you would have seen in the genre, that plays in a more modern day open world type setting where you have to hide in narrow corridors, alleyways, dingy environments, run down and dilapidated buildings, all while using stealth to remain quiet and silent to take out your opponents without them even noticing you. That presents some of the most atmospheric elements ever seen in a video game. But the game also presents one questionable fact to show that it's not just monsters that can haunt the world, but that people can also be the real monsters in this story. And as a result, Manhunt is easily considered as one of the most violent games ever made. But if you're a fan of survival horror in general and you want to play something that presents its own unique take on the genre, then Manhunt is definitely a game that you really do need to experience. It may not be for everybody, but for the select few, you will understand what it entails. When Cold Fear released in 2005, it was met with mixed reviews among critics, comparing it very unfavourably to the success of Resident Evil 4, as it implemented very similar gameplay styles and mechanics that were seen in the iconic survival horror game, that focused a lot more on action, with the use of over-the-shoulder combat mechanics that were made popular by that iconic game. But under the surface, Cold Fear managed to implement many favourable elements that invoked fear in players, as it was a much darker approach to Resident Evil 4 that utilised some very unique and, for its time, very intricate gameplay mechanics that had never been seen before within a video game, with the use of moving environments, with you being placed on a ship investigating the occurrence of crew members being decimated due to an outbreak of a virus that had been on board. But the use of the mechanics also helped to invoke that sense of fear and terror that really unnerved and left you on edge as you played, something that had never been seen before in a survival horror game. And very few would know that this was also the developer's second game that they'd ever developed, as Darkworks had originally worked on Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare only a few years previously. So they had already come from a background of creating unique horror experiences, but they managed to take things a step further with Cold Fear to create one of the most memorable but yet underrated survival horror experiences seen on the PlayStation 2 and even during that time period or that gaming era. It blends a very unique mix of action, but yet very dark and somber tones and atmospheric environments to explore, with narrow hallways and corridors, never knowing where an enemy can surface next. And the only way to truly defeat enemies is to dismember their body parts, a trait that would be similarly seen in 2008's Dead Space, that would become one of the greatest survival horror games of all time. So Cold Fear, in many ways, implemented a lot of those styles and features that were made favourable in some of the later horror entries, but the game would still be overshadowed by the huge success of Resident Evil seen during that time. But for those that want a genuine and scary horror experience, now is the perfect time to experience this underrated classic in all its glory, so that you'll see for yourself how truly terrifying it is. Muan is a very rare and yet unique survival horror game that was released in 2004 and developed by From Software for the PlayStation 2, that is considered by many to be among the rarest and yet one of the most disturbing survival horror games ever made. And the game was created by the developers that had been responsible for the popular Kingsfield series on the original PlayStation, but would also later go on to develop and create some of the greatest games ever in the industry, with the likes of Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Elden Ring, to name but a few. The game is also one of the most sought after titles on the PlayStation 2, as it is so rare, which has resulted in the game being almost impossible to track down due to the insane expensive prices that you will see the game going for online. The game presents a dark narrative with many plot twists that's very dark, gritty, and has some of the most atmospheric elements ever seen in a survival horror game, that sees the narrative of a group of protagonists fending off an outbreak of monsters that have all been consumed by a dark, demonic nature, and each of the characters have their own story plots intertwined into each other that all reflect the story, that will all have their outcomes and tell different elements regarding certain plot twists that you will uncover as you play, as the game does present multiple endings. The game itself, aside from its narrative, did receive mixed reviews at its time, as the mixed responses were based off of players not really being sure of what to expect with regards to the storyline plot, as they didn't really understand the premise of the game, but also due to the graphic nature of the violence that was on offer, as it was very, very dark and very grotesque in how it presented all of its visuals throughout the story. That plays from a very similar gameplay perspective seen in earlier classic survival horror games, with fixed camera perspective seen in Resident Evil, and later with the likes of the Onimusha series that also would have been released on the PlayStation. So it takes a lot of influence from earlier titles that saw huge success. So the gameplay allows you to interact with various characters that utilise a variety of different types of close combat weapons, but also have the ability to use spells and magic in order to defeat opponents, and this will definitely become a necessity if you are to survive. Muan presents another perspective in the survival horror genre that's very dark, gritty, atmospheric, but also tells its plot and story from a very unique perspective that differs from many other titles seen on the system for its time, and as a result is considered to be one of the most unique experiences that you can ever have on the PlayStation 2. Haunting Ground is considered by many to be one of the most rarest and yet unique survival horror experiences to ever be seen on the PlayStation 2 console, that sees the story of a young girl named Fiona waking up inside the dungeon of a castle after being involved in a car accident, where she quickly befriends a dog called Huey, which they then begin to explore the castle with the means of trying to figure out the mysteries of the inhabitants and the surroundings, while also trying to find a way to escape. The game itself shares many similarities with Capcom's earlier survival horror title, Clock Tower 3, and the game is often described as a spiritual successor to the Clock Tower series that requires players to run, interact with objects, solve puzzles, find items of interest to progress further, while also avoiding enemies by using environmental elements, but also using hidden areas like wardrobes, cupboards, beds, anything they can think of to hide from their pursuers in order to survive. The game is very atmospheric in its nature and very cinematic, and for its time it was quite controversial, as it discussed many taboo style topics that weren't really relatable for its time, that managed to mix in the gameplay elements of not only Clock Tower 3 but also games such as the Resident Evil series, that makes so many combinations of different styles to make a very unique experience. With all that being said, Haunting Ground did receive mixed reviews, with many highlights unsure of the game's themes and adult style nature. But when we look back over the game's history, it has now become one of the most sought after and yet one of the most expensive games that you can find, as it is so rare. And due to these reasons, the game has garnered quite a following, with fans fully respecting the game's narrative and storyline plot to make it one of the most unique survival horror titles ever made, as the game presents a very unique foundation of terror and atmosphere, as the player, unlike typical survival horror games, doesn't really have a means to defend themselves other than to use the environments in order to hide and to outwit your opponents, which very few games for its time were ever managed to do correctly, which was a trait not often seen in many horror games during that period. And as a result, Haunting Ground not only is one of the most rarest games to find in the genre, but it also helped to inspire many future entries in survival horror that you can see even into the current day. So if you want a unique experience on the PlayStation, something that discusses many unique and taboo style topics, but that also explores the realm of survival horror from a different perspective, then you need to try out Haunting Ground. Rule of Rose is a very rare survival horror game that was developed for the PlayStation 2 in 2006 that would receive much controversy due to many of its themes, topics and unusual nature. Seeing the plot set in England during the 1930s, revolving around a young teenager who becomes trapped in a world by a group of young girls who have established themselves as a class hierarchy known as the Red Crayon Aristocrats. The game presents a very disturbing lore and narrative that discusses very unusual yet very taboo themes and topics, with scenes of obscene brutality and many unusual elements that moved away from the complexities of more mainstream survival horror games during that period. So much so that the game was inevitably banned in many regions due to the controversy surrounding the material in the game. But for those that managed to gain a glimpse into the world of Rule of Rose, was presented with a very unusual yet very influential survival horror experience that took a lot of its inspiration from both Silent Hill and Haunting Ground, that made the use of very atmospheric elements with psychological horror mechanics and fixed camera perspectives that delved into the psyche of the player, but also having to utilise physical elements such as weapons, solving puzzles and just using anything in their environment in order to survive the ordeal, while also trying to understand the plot and the controversy surrounding the actual story in the game. But due to the controversy surrounding the title itself and leading to it being banned in many countries, has resulted in the game being one of the most sought after and yet rarest survival horror games ever created within the games industry. So much so that to hunt down a copy will cost you hundreds, if not thousands, to find a decent copy online. So if you do manage to experience the game, you will be presented with a very unusual, dark, yet very disturbing survival horror experience. Don't let the reviews in the magazines throw you off, as this game will definitely leave a lasting impact for many years to come, due to the obscene, graphic and unusual themes and nature presented in the game that discusses many unique elements not seen in other horror titles. So for those reasons alone, if you want to explore something that is very, very different, that is very scary, but also uses a very different take on psychological elements not seen before in survival horror, then you need to play Rule of Rose. In 2003, Forbidden Siren, also known as just Siren in the Japanese region, was unleashed in the gaming world. That was created by the same creator that helped work on the Silent Hill series, so you can kind of get an idea as to what you can expect in terms of scares and overall tension, and Forbidden Siren is one of those games that manages to do that in abundance. The game itself produced a sequel and also a complete remake that saw life on the early days of the PS3 console, and is considered by many to be among the scariest series of games of all time. During its time when it was released, it was also one of the most realistic looking, with facial recognition used on the characters themselves to make them almost lifelike, which was very, very disturbing and very subjective in its nature, that sees a group of survivors trying to survive a cult curse that has overtaken a small village where all of the inhabitants have been turned into zombie-like creatures. But unlike other games seen like with Silent Hill or Resident Evil, the zombies in this game have their own intelligent behaviour where they act and interact with different environmental elements and they go about their daily chores, but if they see someone that looks different to them, their instant reaction is to attack them and try and kill them. So the whole goal is either to defeat them or to avoid them completely by sneaking around them. But unfortunately the enemies themselves are pretty much immortal, so even by taking them out you only have a limited time before they will rise again, so you need to make sure you're well away from them before that happens. The games themselves are considered to be among the scariest ever seen on any console. They really are dark and atmospheric, with the unique advantage of being able to use a feature called sight jacking that allows you to see through the eyes of the enemies within the area, so you can determine their movement patterns so that you can try and avoid them, especially if you're looking for items of interest or you just need to get out of the area. This unique feature will allow you to pinpoint exact locations so that you can avoid them at all costs. Even though it's considered among some of the scariest games ever made, the reception that the game received was mixed, and a lot of it was mainly due to the clunky control system, as the controls can be very tedious and just fiddly to use. But even in terms of the story plot, while it actually has a very good story, the plot perception is quite tedious, requiring you to play the same levels over and over again in order to achieve different objectives so that you can progress the story and unlock the game's multiple endings. But that doesn't take away from the fact that this is without a doubt one of the scariest games ever made. It's very dark, very gritty, very atmospheric, if not one of the most atmospheric games you will ever play. It just leaves you with such an unnerving feeling that the impact it will leave you with will last for a very long time after playing. So if you want a scary series of games to play, then you definitely have to start off with this unique classic. Silent Hill 2 would be the sequel to 1999's acclaimed Silent Hill game that saw a release firstly on the PlayStation console, and its sequel being developed also by Team Silent and published by Konami Computer Entertainment would end up becoming and being also considered as one of the greatest survival horror games of all time and one of the greatest games ever made. That managed to combine elements of the previous game, taking a lot of influence from previous survival horror games on earlier consoles, that discussed and presented very taboo topics and material to create an overall unnerving sense of tension and atmosphere that very few games before had ever managed to accomplish. It was also backed with great level design, visuals, sound effects, and a dark and eerie soundtrack that also complemented the game's aesthetics. That also helped to drive the narrative in the game. Seeing the player take on the role of James Sunderland, who travels to Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his supposedly dead wife and trying to figure out the events of what occurred and what has led him to his current endeavour. But along the way he is met with an eerie sense of foreboding, with dark, eerie lit atmosphere, all surrounded by an unusual fog or mist that surrounds the town of Silent Hill, very like that scene in the first game, that transitions into a different world at different points in the game, where even more grotesque and hideous monsters lie in wait to provide even more fear and dread towards the player. The game would discuss varying narratives and topics that looks at mental illness, the psychology of people, depression, abuse, punishment, all of the disturbing elements of the human psyche that all contribute to the dark and gritty atmosphere that the game presents, all while being accompanied and being pursued by a relentless enemy known as the Pyramid Head that is in constant pursuit, that will literally destroy anything in its wake. The game gives you the perception that your dreams and nightmares can become a reality. That is one of the unique aspects, and it plays out in a chilling narrative that very few games have ever been able to master, that has left such an impact on players over the generations, that has presented with the upcoming remake or remaster of the game that is currently in the works, to allow players to experience and witness the enthralling horror all over again. But as you play, you also have access to different scenarios where you can play as another character with Maria, who looks identical and is almost a spitting image of James's dead wife, where you explore her backstory and how she came to be within Silent Hill and how the two characters' stories intertwine to create an even deeper narrative. So if you've played the first game in the series, or if you've played any of the games from the Silent Hill franchise, you owe it to yourself to play what is arguably considered to be one of the greatest games, if not the greatest game in the franchise, but also one of the scariest games ever made. Fatal Frame, otherwise known as Project Zero in other regions, is a survival horror game that was developed by Tecmo for the PlayStation 2 and was released in Japan in 2001 and later in other regions in 2002. The game would also get a subsequent release on the Xbox console and would become the first in a series of horror games to utilise many unique elements, gameplay features, to create a great sense of unnerving tension and atmosphere that was even more prominent and impactful when we look at other games such as Silent Hill and the Resident Evil series. While Fatal Frame does take a lot of influences from those iconic series, it manages to encapsulate its own elements to create a very unique and fear-inducing adventure that definitely will leave a lasting impact. that requires you to explore a variety of different areas, old dilapidated Japanese style buildings, and using a mythical camera that you must use in order to defeat the ghastly creatures and ghosts that inhabit each environment, as the ghosts to the naked eye can very rarely be seen, and the only way to engage with them in encounters is to use the camera that you find as you play. Without this, the likelihood of survival is very slim. The first 3 Fatal Frame games on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox are considered to be among the best, most visually impressive and most downright disturbing horror games ever created on any system. And even though there is new, more modern sequels that have been released over previous years, while they do stick to the same formula and are very scary and really good games in their own right, they just don't have the same impact that the previous or the original games in the series had all the way back almost 20 years ago. So for that reason alone, Fatal Frame, whichever version of the game, whether you play its sequels on the PS2, is a deserving franchise of horror games that you must play if you truly want to experience some of the most unnerving and disturbing elements ever seen within survival horror. The Fatal Frame series will definitely give you that in abundance. Silent Hill 4 The Room was released for the PlayStation 2, Xbox and Windows PC in 2004 and would be the last game developed by the legendary Team Silent, but would also move away from various gameplay elements seen in previous games in the series. Primarily, the story takes place completely outside of Silent Hill altogether, that sees players take on the role of Henry Townsend as he attempts to escape from his lockdown apartment and ends up finding himself in a supernatural world where he must uncover hidden secrets, defeat enemies and deal with some of the most grotesque elements ever witnessed in a video game. The gameplay style alters greatly from the previous entries in the series, moving away from the over-the-shoulder or third-person perspective for most of the game in many respects, in favour of having segments within the apartment itself being played from a first-person point of view, but would gradually go back to a third-person camera interacting with the demonic world once you enter it. And at each stage, Henry must delve into the demonic realm to uncover other tasks and solve puzzles, and to find even more ways to try and find a way to escape from his apartment that leads him on a completely different course from what was originally intended. While this is the 4th game in the series, very few people even know that it's also considered as the most disturbing game in the franchise, as it depicts a lot of taboo elements and discusses a lot of topics, even more so than the previous entries, that really dives into the human psyche to fully understand how your surroundings and various elements can influence the human mind that can possibly drive you insane. And the game is presented in a way that has unprecedented attention to its unique use of atmosphere and fear-inducing elements that provides a true sense of terror that previous games in the series, while scary, don't even come close to. Even to this day, Silent Hill 4 The Room is still considered to be the creepiest and yet most disturbing game in the entire franchise, but it is often overlooked as it moves away from all of the elements seen in the previous 3 games in the series, so a lot of players tend to move away and play either later games or go back to the original 3 games. But truthfully, this game in its own right is one of the scariest and most fear-inducing games ever made, and you owe it to yourself to experience this underrated classic in all its glory, not only just to play an entry in the Silent Hill franchise, but really to experience one of the most well thought out, well designed and most fear-inducing titles ever created within the games industry. So now with this list of what I consider to be 12 of the scariest survival horror games ever released on the PS2, you will get a clear idea of the iconic and atmospheric nature of many of these disturbing titles, what they presented, what they represented more to the point, and how they influenced not only the genre but the gaming industry, how they also questioned many topics and themes that were pretty much either unheard of or that were just too taboo to be discussed discussed in mainstream media. Many of these games on this list help to push the boundaries of what was possible within gaming, to bring things to a whole new level. So it's interesting to revisit many of these titles, just to experience all of the fear-inducing elements, but also to witness the birth of many new changes within the game's genre in general. And if you have watched the video up until this point, I would love to know your thoughts. Do you agree with the games on this list, or what would be your top 12 favourite games or horror games that you would see or like to play on the PlayStation? So be sure to share it down in the comments below, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like on the video to be updated with future content. And if you would like to see more stories and concepts behind the many other survival horror titles that were also released on the PS2, then you can check out this video next on screen that will discuss the history and rise of the horror games that revolutionised the console.